The sound of the mop bucket tipping over echoed sharply across the marble floor, the metallic clang slicing through the stillness of the grand hall like a sudden cry in a cathedral. Soapy water spilled outward in shimmering ripples spreading like a silver mirror beneath the glittering chandelier. Each droplet caught the golden light and scattered it into trembling reflections, painting fragments of the ceiling on the floor. For a fleeting moment, that pool of light reflected the wide, terrified eyes of the man who had dropped it. His name was Caleb Ward, a janitor in his early 30s dressed in a light blue uniform that smelled faintly of detergent and rain. His rough hands, scarred, calloused, and cracked from years of invisible labor, were trembling uncontrollably, though not from exhaustion. Inside, something deeper was stirring. A rush of recognition, a wave of disbelief. His gaze was locked on a single portrait hanging on the cream-colored wall ahead of him. It wasn't just a painting, it was a ghost from another lifetime, staring straight through him as if time itself had folded back upon its hinges. His breath caught in his throat, heart hammering against his ribs as though trying to escape. The air seemed to thin, and the marble beneath his shoes suddenly felt fragile, unreal. It was a large, golden-framed painting of a little girl. Her soft curls glowed like spun honey, her bright blue eyes shimmering with life so vivid it almost seemed she might blink. Her expression was calm yet hauntingly familiar, a quiet innocence that carried the weight of memory. Caleb's body tensed, his chest constricted as 1,000 images flooded his mind. Laughter echoing through a damp orphanage corridor, a lullaby whispered into the dark. A small voice that once said, "Don't leave me, Mr. Caleb." His knees weakened beneath the invisible pull of remembrance. He stumbled back, gripping his chest as if holding himself together might stop the ache from spreading. "It can't be her," he breathed, his voice trembling, breaking, pleading. But the more he denied it, the louder his heart whispered the truth. That face, those eyes, the same spark he had seen years ago in the child who had made him believe in something beyond struggle. The same girl who once shared a piece of bread with him when both were hungry. The same girl who had taught him that love doesn't come from blood, it comes from kindness. And in that moment, as tears blurred his vision, a quiet thought surfaced within him. Perhaps nothing in this universe is lost forever. Perhaps love finds its way back through the cracks of time, carrying the same eyes, the same soul, the same song. Sunlight streamed through the tall French windows of Briarwood Mansion, spilling warmth across the cream walls and antique furniture. The air shimmered with dust motes that looked like tiny golden stars floating between worlds. The scent of polish mingled with roses, but beneath it lay something unspoken, the silence of destiny awakening. Caleb stood frozen, half drenched in the reflection of a life he thought he'd left behind, while across from him stood Margaret Vale, the mansion's owner. Margaret was a woman of quiet poise, every inch of her presence sculpted by grace. Her soft blonde hair glowed in the sunlight like silk, and her gray-blue eyes carried the calm wisdom of someone who had seen beauty, loss, and rebirth in equal measure. Known as an art curator, she had dedicated her life to restoring forgotten masterpieces. But as she watched the trembling janitor before her, she felt perhaps for the first time that she was standing before a different kind of restoration, the restoration of a soul. The porcelain teacup on the carved oak table beside her remained untouched, steam curling upward and fading into the light. The silence between them thickened, heavy as prayer. Caleb's reflection shimmered faintly in the spilled water at his feet, distorted, almost ghost-like. He couldn't look away from the portrait. Every brushstroke felt alive, pulsing with the same heartbeat he once knew. The little girl in the painting looked about 5 or 6, the same age Anna had been when thunder frightened her in that orphanage years ago. Caleb could almost feel her small hands gripping his shirt, could almost hear her whispering, "You're my only family, Mr. Caleb." That memory pierced through him like a ray of light cutting through clouds, and as it did, another whisper rose from somewhere deeper than memory. A voice not of the past but of spirit. "You are never truly alone. What you give in love always returns. What you lose in time, the universe restores in divine order." Caleb closed his eyes for a heartbeat, feeling tears slide down his face. A quiet warmth began to stir within him, the faint hum of remembrance but also of forgiveness. Life had taken, yes, but perhaps it was also giving back now, in ways he did not yet understand. He stood taller, though his voice was still fragile. "If she's real," he thought, If there's even a chance she survived, then maybe miracles do exist. The thought itself became an affirmation, echoing softly within him. Hope still breathes in places forgotten. Love never disappears. It transforms. Every loss holds the seed of a return. The sunlight seemed to pulse in response, glowing warmer, brighter. Margaret, watching him closely, felt a shiver pass through her, a knowing she couldn't explain. Something in that moment bound them both to the same truth. Destiny was speaking, and its voice was gentle but unyielding. Caleb took a breath, his heart steadying for the first time in years. The mansion around him no longer felt like marble and distance. It felt like a crossroads, a place between endings and beginnings, a place where spirit guided flesh and where forgotten souls recognized one another again. He whispered once more, not in disbelief now, but in reverence. It is her. It has to be. And somewhere beyond reason, in that sliver of golden light that danced across the chandelier and shimmered through the spilled water, it almost felt like the universe was nodding back. Every ending becomes a beginning when seen through love. Every memory is a bridge, not a wound. You are guided, protected, and seen, even when you think you are invisible. And as Caleb stood there, breathing in the quiet magic of that realization, the air in Briarwood Mansion seemed to hum with unseen energy, the promise that no act of love ever goes unnoticed, and that sometimes the faces that return to us are not coincidences, but confirmations. He had promised her that he would never leave. That vow had lived in his heart like a prayer, fragile, sacred, and unbroken, even as the world around him tore itself apart. Caleb Ward had carried that promise through storms and empty nights, through loneliness and years of searching that blurred together like rain on glass. But life, as he had learned again and again, was rarely kind to men like him, men who had little, who gave everything and were still asked for more, men whose hearts carried love they could never afford to lose. Years ago, in a forgotten orphanage that smelled of dust, wet wood, and sorrow, he had knelt beside a little girl with tangled curls and eyes like morning sky. Her name was Anna, and she had clung to him the way lost souls cling to light. He remembered the way her voice would tremble whenever thunder rolled outside the broken windows, and how he would whisper promises to calm her shaking hands. "I'll never leave, sweetheart. Not while you need me." He had meant it with everything he had. In that small, crumbling building filled with laughter that refused to die, he had found something purer than survival. He had found purpose. But one winter morning, when the air bit through the cracked glass and the heater groaned its last breath, Caleb went out in search of work. The children were cold, their lips pale, their blankets thin as paper. He told Anna he'd be back before supper, that he'd fix the heat, that he'd bring warmth home to them again. It was supposed to be a few hours, just one morning, and then he'd return to her waiting smile. When he came back, the world had shifted. The orphanage gates were chained shut. The windows were dark. The air, once filled with children's laughter, now carried only the hollow echo of wind. A single notice hung on the door, stamped with ink that had already begun to run from the rain. The city had closed it just like that. Overnight, they'd moved every child to better facilities, but no one could tell him where those better places were. The files were missing, the records gone, and the faces he begged for answers looked through him as if he were invisible. Still, Caleb searched. For weeks, for months, then for years. He walked through shelters, through streets lined with forgotten souls, through the offices of people who had long stopped caring. He carried with him a single ribbon, the same one Anna had tied in her hair the day before he left. Faded now, frayed at the edges, but still holding the faintest trace of her. Sometimes on quiet nights he would hold it to his heart and whisper into the dark, "I'll find you, I promise." Every promise spoken in love becomes eternal, the soul whispered back. No distance can erase what the heart remembers. What is lost in the world is never lost in the spirit. And now, standing in the radiant halls of Briarwood Mansion, surrounded by chandeliers, marble, and silence that smelled faintly of roses and polish, Caleb saw her again. That same face, those same eyes, frozen forever in oil and color, framed in gold and memory, his breath caught in his throat, the mop slipping from his hand as if gravity had forgotten him. His entire body trembled, his chest burned. The sound of his own heartbeat drowned the ticking clock. The portrait stared back at him. A child no older than 6, her blue eyes shimmering with gentle wonder, her smile caught between innocence and eternity. The light from the chandelier touched her curls, turning them into strands of sunlight. Caleb's vision blurred. For a moment, it was no longer paint. It was a heartbeat. It was her. Energy never dies, it transforms. Love cannot fade. It waits. When your soul is ready, what you lost returns in a new form. Margaret Vale, the owner of the mansion, noticed the trembling in his hands. Her expression softened, confusion shadowing her graceful composure. Her pale blue eyes followed his gaze toward the portrait, her head tilting slightly as though she too felt something unusual in the still air. The morning light streamed through the French windows, catching the tears beginning to well in Caleb's eyes. To her, it was a painting. To him it was resurrection. To her it was color and memory. To him it was time rewound. He raised his hand, voice cracking like a broken instrument. "Ma'am," he said softly, almost reverently, the girl lived with me in the orphanage." The words hung there, fragile, trembling, alive. The sound seemed to ripple through the room like thunder rolling in a distant valley. The silence that followed was almost holy. Outside life went on, a rake scraping faintly in the garden, the soft cooing of birds basking in midday warmth. But inside, time had stopped. The air thickened until it felt alive with memory. Caleb could hardly breathe. His eyes never left the portrait. He half expected the painted child to blink, to breathe, to turn her head and smile like she used to when he read fairy tales from torn books under flickering bulbs. "Memories are not prisons," the spirit whispered through his racing heart. "They are bridges, and every bridge leads home." He saw her again in his mind. Anna sitting cross-legged on the floor, her knees pulled tight against her chest, eyes wide and endless. "Do you think my real parents will find me?" she had asked. He had smiled for her sake even as his own heart broke. Yes, he had promised. They will. He'd wanted to believe it. He had believed it. But as the years passed, that hope had turned into a prayer whispered only to himself. Margaret's footsteps were soft as she moved closer to the portrait. She stood beside him now, her expression changing slowly from curiosity to something gentler, something touched by empathy. The morning light framed her in gold, and when she spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "That's my niece," she said after a pause, each word deliberate, heavy. "Her name was Clara. She passed away 7 years ago." The words struck Caleb like a blade. Passed away? They didn't echo. They just fell silent and final into the pit of his chest. His vision dimmed around the edges, the sunlight glaring too bright, too cruel. He stepped back, gripping the mop handle, but it couldn't anchor him. The weight of grief was too heavy to stand against. His entire body shook, and for a moment he thought the world might simply fade. He had found her and lost her again in the same breath. "But nothing truly dies," whispered the unseen voice of his heart. "Love moves through lifetimes, through forms, through names. Every connection you make in love is written into the universe itself." The polished floor gleamed beneath his feet, reflecting his shadow, the chandelier, and the golden frame above him. The reflection rippled softly in the water he had spilled earlier, distorting the girl's face into shifting light. He stared down at it through his tears, realizing that maybe this was what love was, something that never vanished, only changed shape. He remembered the promise. "I'll never leave you." And suddenly he knew it was true. He hadn't, not really. The bond that had once kept them alive in that broken orphanage had simply transformed, waiting across years, across realms, across the thin line that separates the seen from the unseen. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The grief was still there, sharp and raw, but beneath it was something else, a stillness, a presence, a whisper of peace. "Even in loss I am guided. Even in endings, there are beginnings. I am never without love, because love never leaves." As Caleb stood there, trembling in the quiet grandeur of the mansion, he felt warmth return to his heart. The painting no longer looked haunting, it looked radiant. The light glowed brighter through the windows, casting golden ripples over the floor, and in that light, something within him finally began to heal. Love is eternal. Promises spoken in truth are kept by the soul. And somewhere, somehow, she still knows. He never left. A hollow ache flooded through Caleb's chest, an ache that went deeper than grief. It was guilt, raw and relentless, the kind that lived in the bones. He had failed her once, and now it felt as though the world itself had taken her before he could ever make it right. His heart felt too heavy to hold, each breath catching like a sob he couldn't quite release. Across from him, Margaret Vale turned fully to face him. Her eyes, pale and steady, studied his trembling form. She had seen people moved to tears by art before. Collectors, critics, guests who wept over the tragedy or beauty captured on canvas. But this was different. This wasn't about the art at all. This was about a man confronting the ghost of his own past. A man staring into a mirror of what he'd lost. There was something unbearably human in the way Caleb looked at that portrait, as though the child inside it was the only truth that had ever mattered to him. Margaret's voice came softly, careful not to break the fragile stillness. She asked him what he meant, how he knew the girl, why his voice had cracked when he said her name. And that simple question, that gentle nudge of curiosity, broke open something inside him. Caleb began to speak, not in rehearsed sentences or tidy explanations, but in a torrent of confession, the kind that comes from years of silence. His story unfolded like an old photograph being developed, slowly, painfully, layer by layer. He told her about the orphanage, about the cold winters and broken heaters, about the children who had nobody but each other. He spoke of the closures, the officials who never looked him in the eye, and the night he realized that poverty wasn't just about hunger, it was about being invisible. And then he spoke of Anna, the little girl who used to follow him through the dim hallways, her laughter echoing through the darkness like sunlight breaking into shadow. He spoke of how she believed in him when he had nothing left to believe in himself. He told Margaret how he had promised her safety, how he had left only for a day, and how the world had stolen her in that brief absence. His words trembled, his voice cracked, and yet every syllable carried the weight of someone who didn't know how to lie, someone who had lived too close to truth all his life. By the time his story ended, there was a stillness between them so complete it felt sacred. Margaret's hands trembled slightly at her sides, her chest rising with quiet, uneven breaths. That night she could not sleep. Caleb's words replayed in her mind, his grief, his sincerity, his lost hope. And somewhere within them, something had begun to stir. The next afternoon, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain, Margaret found herself in the mansion's old library. It was a place she rarely entered, filled with her sister's old records, adoption papers, and collections of family archives. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, falling in slow golden sheets that turned the drifting dust into tiny constellations. The air smelled faintly of aged paper and forgotten time. She walked along the rows of shelves until she reached the drawer labeled with her sister's name. She hesitated only a moment before pulling out a worn folder marked Clara Vale. The edges were frayed from age, the ink fading. But as she began to read, something caught her attention, a small inconsistency, a date that didn't match. Her brow furrowed as she traced the line with her finger. The adoption record stated that Clara had been transferred from a local orphanage the same year Caleb had spoken of, the same one the city had shut down for unsafe conditions. Her pulse quickened. She turned another page, her eyes narrowing in concentration. And then she saw it, a name, scribbled at the bottom of a transfer approval form, Caleb Ward. For a heartbeat, everything inside her went still. Her breath caught halfway in her throat. The realization hit her with a quiet force that made her eyes sting. She wasn't sure what it meant, only that it changed everything. She closed the folder with trembling fingers and clutched it to her chest as she hurried from the library, her footsteps echoing softly down the marble corridor. When she found Caleb, he was right where he had been the day before, on his knees, mop in hand, methodically cleaning the same expanse of marble floor. The sunlight slanted across his uniform, catching the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. When he looked up, his eyes were tired, wary. He had the look of a man always waiting to be dismissed, to be forgotten, to be told that his presence was a mistake. Margaret paused for a moment, watching him in silence, feeling the weight of what she was about to reveal. Without a word, she stepped forward and held out the folder. Her fingers shook slightly as she placed it in his hands. He looked down at it, confused, hesitant. Then slowly he opened it. The papers inside crackled softly as he turned them, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, the faded dates, until they landed on his own signature. For a long second he didn't move. Then he exhaled, a sound that was part laugh, part sob, part release. His knees buckled slightly as he pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. A single tear slipped down his cheek, followed by another. "I signed her transfer," he whispered hoarsely. "I sent her to her family." His voice broke completely, but this time the pain in it was not hollow. It was full, rich, alive with the weight of truth and the strange mercy of knowing. For the first time in years, he was no longer searching in the dark. He had found her, not in the way he had hoped, not in the arms of reunion, but in the certainty that she had been loved, cherished, and remembered. And somewhere in the quiet halls of Briarwood Mansion, the light shifted again, softer now, warmer, as though the house itself was exhaling a long-held breath. The grief did not vanish, but it settled. Caleb's heart, still cracked and tender, began to beat with something new, something that felt almost like peace. Margaret realized then, with a sudden breath-stealing clarity, that none of this was coincidence. The threads of fate had been quietly weaving this moment long before either of them had known it. The little girl in the painting, her niece Clara, had once been Anna, the same orphan who had clung to Caleb Ward all those years ago in that forgotten orphanage. Her late sister had adopted the child quietly, changing her name and taking her far away when she moved abroad for treatment. No one had told Caleb. No one had thought to. And now, standing in the soft glow of the afternoon light, the truth unfolded with a bittersweet grace that neither tragedy nor time could erase. The girl he had once believed lost to the world had not died unloved. She had been cherished deeply, wholly, beautifully. She had been given a family, an education, and a chance to see the world beyond those gray orphanage walls. And before illness took her, she had left behind more than sorrow. She had left art, laughter, and the imprint of love in the form of the portrait that now hung before them. Margaret's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she turned to look at Caleb. His face, worn and humble, was illuminated by the golden light streaming through the tall windows. Tears traced down his weathered cheeks as he reached out a trembling hand to touch the edge of the portrait's ornate frame. His fingers hovered just above the painted curls as though afraid to disturb the image, yet desperate to feel her presence. Margaret's voice, soft and reverent, broke the silence. "Maybe," she whispered, "just maybe she never forgot you." Her words trembled in the air, fragile as glass. She told him about Clara's last sketchbook, the one she had never understood until now. Among the drawings of flowers and sunlight and childish dreams, there had been one peculiar image. A man in a blue uniform, standing beneath a tall window, with a bucket and a mop. For years, Margaret had assumed it was a random figure, but now she knew. Clara had remembered him, the kind janitor who had once been her whole world. Caleb's lips quivered into the faintest smile as tears continued to spill freely. His voice came out low, cracked with emotion, barely a whisper. "She remembered me," he said, and in those 3 words lived a lifetime of love, loss, and redemption. He didn't ask for anything more, no money, no recognition, no sympathy. He simply stood there, silent and still, like a man who had finally been given back a piece of his soul. For years, he had lived with the weight of guilt, believing he had failed the only child who ever saw him as more than a janitor. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by sunlight and memory, the burden lifted. The mansion, once heavy with silence and sorrow, seemed to breathe again. The air felt lighter, alive, as if the spirit of the little girl in the portrait was smiling, grateful that her 2 worlds had finally found each other at last. If this story has touched your heart, the narrator's voice might have said, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kind Heart Stories, because hope, compassion, and second chances are what keep the world kind. But in that room, no words were needed. The truth had already spoken. Weeks passed, and though the world outside moved on, something gentle had changed within the grand halls of Briarwood Mansion. Margaret, moved by what had happened, offered Caleb a full-time position at the estate, not out of pity but out of respect. This house, she told him, needs someone who understands what it means to care. And so he stayed, not as just a janitor, but as its quiet guardian, its keeper of memory. Together, he and Margaret began restoring the mansion's gallery, turning it from a collection of private relics into a space filled with meaning and love. They opened a small wing in memory of Clara, a bright, welcoming space filled with paintings of children from orphanages across the city. Caleb worked with steady hands and a heart unburdened, cleaning each frame with the same tenderness he once used to comfort frightened children on stormy nights. Sometimes, late in the evening when the halls were quiet, he would pause before Clara's portrait. The chandelier's glow would fall softly on her painted face, and he would whisper, "Good night, sweetheart," before moving on, a faint smile touching his lips. The sadness never fully disappeared, but it had transformed into peace, the kind that only comes when love is finally understood. The past no longer haunted him. It simply lived beside him, gentle and forgiving. Before the story fades to its final scene, the voice of Kind Heart Stories invites viewers to reflect. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Caleb's place? And as the camera slowly pans across the golden light pouring through the mansion's tall French windows, it settles once more on Caleb. He stands beneath the portrait, his hand pressed softly over his heart, eyes lifted toward the painted face that had once called him family. The light catches the tears in his eyes, turning them into something almost holy. For the first time in years, he no longer looks like a man who has lost everything. He looks like a father who has finally been found.